The following is a conversation with Edward Saatchi and Frank Carey, the co-founders of Fable Studio. Fable is a VR studio building next-generation AI authoring tools to create interactive characters who can live, learn, and make decisions. One of their projects is Emmy Award-winning Lucy, an 8-year-old virtual being adapted from children's book The Wolves in the Walls. Lucy can have natural conversations with people thanks to dialogue generated by GPT-3. If you like this type of content and are interested in GPT-3, make sure to hit the subscribe button and check out our GPT-3 manual book by O'Reilly. This is Sandra and Shubham, and we hope you enjoy our interview. Thank you so much, first of all, for taking the time to talk to us. We are kind of on a mission to gather the most interesting insights coming from the companies that have been through a path with GPT-3. And your company is one of the unique ones. The way you're using GPT-3 is something very unique, so we are hoping to learn more about that today. Maybe for starters, it would be great to actually understand a little bit of more context about your company. So it would be great if you could tell us how Fable Studio was founded and how did it look like before GPT-3 came into your picture.
Yeah, we had a character called Lucy in the virtual reality movie Wolves in the Walls that we created at Oculus Story Studio. So I founded Oculus Story Studio, and then that was acquired into Oculus, which was acquired into Facebook, and we created the first real-time virtual reality movie, won several primetime Emmys, and our final virtual reality movie was Wolves in the Walls, based on a Neil Gaiman piece. And we noticed that people were talking to and interacting with the virtual being, and we could see there was an emotional connection to Lucy. And we thought, well, what if we could actually use AI to create a new category of storytelling and entertainment and create virtual beings. And so now we're doing that across many different characters and trying to learn how to harness AI and storytelling together.
Can you also, following up on that, can you also tell us a little bit about your process and in which part of the process you use GPT-3 mainly, and how does it look like?
I guess so far we've been using it on one-on-one conversations over text message and video chat with characters, but we're also exploring using it in 3D simulated worlds as well, where the characters can be avatars and communicate with you there. I don't know, Frank, if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, I'd say for the last 18 months or so, we've had a character, Lucy, who you're able to go have one-on-one conversations with through a Hangout like this. And we have a kind of series of technologies that allow her to generate audio on the fly and actually speak to you in generated voice, and her lip sync works and just gestures and things like that. And so a key element of that is us coming up with the right content. So you can pre-author some content, but some of the content needs to be kind of impromptu. And so for the impromptu content, using GPT-3 to come up with some of that content, and even using GPT to play test against. So you can treat GPT as the human, and you're sort of playing the character, and going back and forth with GPT-3 helps you come up with what would someone ask in this situation? What would the follow-up be if this was the set of dialogue? What would be the next thing that someone would say? Getting a bunch of options and then evaluating okay, make sure we have this covered or that covered, that type of thing. So yeah, it's we use it, I'd say, for a lot of different things, including the authorship itself. And I think in some ways that's where it shines the most, because you can have GPT come up with a bunch of options for you, but in the moment, but if they're not of good quality, then depending on your experience, it's not going to have a good outcome, right? A good example where we used GPT-3, I think to its sort of fullest extent, was we had during the Sundance Film Festival. What was that last year already now, Ed? Or at least it was early this year. The Sundance Film Festival was all virtual this year, and so Lucy actually joined the Sundance Film Festival as a virtual participant, first ever virtual character to do that. And at the event, she actually collaborated with some other people who were at the event to create a short film, and that was part of her story, that she's creating a short film. And so if you go up on our website, you can see the short film she created with Dracula and things like that. But the actual ideation process of taking these other participants who did not know Lucy or us beforehand, collaborating with them through the weekend, and then coming up with the ideas for how to, like, what to put into the movie, was heavily reliant on GPT-3. And so, we're sort of curating what options we choose from GPT-3, but allowing GPT-3 to come up with the concepts, bouncing ideas off of the participants also contributing back to what the ideas were, feeding that back into GPT-3 and seeing what was coming out. And the key there was, it's one thing just to generate a bunch of random things with GPT-3, but it's a whole another thing to make sure it's in the voice of that character. So we had techniques that we're using we can talk about that here, to sort of to create those prompts so that the character is well defined for GPT-3. So it knows the voice that it's, generating, more so than if you don't do that, you're just going to get it'll just play along with the vibe, but it might be picking up on the sort of, in this case, Lucy's an 8-year-old. So it might be picking up a more of an adult vibe from the participant and feeding that back to them. But we actually want to be speaking in more of a, 8-year-old child, child wonder voice. So that was all part of the challenge, I think.
Following up on that, Frank, as we all know, GPT-3 is not an open source model, and it is charged per API call on the basis of per API call, right? So have you also experimented with other open source models or techniques to generate a similar kind of experience, the content generation experience that you get with GPT-3?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Hugging Face is known to have a bunch of models that are, I would say, comparable to some of the least powerful models. So with OpenAI's version of GPT-3, there are essentially 4 tiers, like A, B, C, D. D is Da Vinci, which is the most powerful one, gives you the best result typically, but is also the most expensive to run by orders of magnitude. It sort of goes up by orders of magnitude each level. So when we did recent experiments with some of the Hugging Face models, there's just much less parameters in those models, so they're expected to do less. But they weren't as competitive at the time we tested it with the full Da Vinci model of GPT-3, and that was somewhat to be expected. Now, just this weekend, I saw a couple of new models came out that they sort of pruned the large GPT-3 model and retrain it, and there's claims that it is competitive. But I've yet to see that tested out, so I can't speak to it. It's just a matter of time, though. I think, some of those things are just, you actually just need that many parameters to get certain results, but it also depends on what you're using for it. So if you're using GPT-3 to, I don't know, detect cancer or something like that, right? That's a whole thing that really wasn't trained for, so you'd have to fine tune it to do something like that. For a lot of what it was trained for was dialogue, so it does a pretty good job, I think, of doing dialogue and story generation and things like that. So it depends on your use case, what the level you need, and that's why they offer these different levels too. If you're using GPT for something simple like sentiment analysis or something like that, you may not need the full model, right? You can just use a simpler model for that. And so I appreciate that they offered that level, because it gets quite expensive if you just use the sort of the top of the line model all the time. There's plenty of other techniques. Sometimes you have something written already, and it's a matter of just finding the right thing that was written, so it becomes kind of a tree search problem. So yeah, there's other techniques there for sure. But as far as pure content generation, you sort of set up the prompt. I think GPT is definitely it's an exciting interface, right? You don't have to be a computer scientist to go into their playground and start typing things out. And so, some of our designers and writers, it's been a really fun tool, because we don't have to set up something complicated for them. They can go in and they can at least experiment with the tool. And then it's a matter of, experimentation is one thing, but getting a consistently good answer is a whole other thing.
what was your reasons for introducing a large language model such as GPT-3 in the first place into your creative process? Like, how did you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's been a writing partner, and sometimes it's been something that can fill in the gaps around what's happening. So we might kind of think through, this is what's going to happen to the character this week, this is what's going to happen to the character next week, and GPT-3 filling in some of those gaps. But we have to kind of, for a character, rather than for a therapist chatbot or for a kind of, let's say, archetypal character like Dracula, for a character we're building and who's living, we have to put up fences more for what it can say. So, there's certain things that the character wouldn't say, and so we have found it is limited around coming up with the character's day-to-day life itself without us guiding it a lot as authors.
I'm also curious, like about the history of GPT-3, basically just like appearing, in your territory as one of the toolboxes that you could use to create narratives. Like, was it that you were following the advancements in AI and were just like looking for how to experiment with it in your context, in a virtual reality studio context, or was it a matter of just like sheer random experiment? Like how did that happen, sort of?
Yeah, before being the CTO, I was leading the machine learning research effort, and so we're paying attention to kind of all the news and anything that was coming out. We're excited to see, GPT sort of first release announcement was a little bit stymied by the fact that they actually weren't going to release this model as open source. They weren't going to release the parameters, right? And they wanted to hold it back, and they're very nervous about people using it for bad reasons and things like that. So it made a lot of headlines that way, and people were definitely excited for the capabilities that it would have, because you were able to sort of see some examples, but you weren't actually able to go in and test it out. And when they finally made the announcement that it was going to be publicly available in beta, I just reached out to the CTO over there, Greg, and kind of asked for an invite, because I thought we were doing a lot of cool things on our end already with virtual beings, and it would be a great test platform to leverage that. And so we got access, and there's so many different things. It's sort of it's a tool, not a it's a tool that we can use for many different things and used in different ways. So a lot of the first effort was just experimenting with it. If I put these inputs in, what are the inputs I get out? Like, could it recreate Dracula? Could it recreate popular podcast characters? Does it know about this? Does it know about that? And I think consistently we were surprised with how good it could be. And so it was, I think a sort of target of opportunity where we didn't necessarily know that we needed something like that per se, but the fact that it was available was something we could take advantage of in a bunch of different ways. So we were kind of early to experiment with it, and gave some early feedback about how well it was working for us for our use case. We've been in touch with the product team and the marketing team over there, and so it's been good to be able to hopefully shape the quality of the product too, and just say, like, these are the things that are working, these are the things that we need help with. One of the hurdles, though, to going live with it, or even just simple experiments with it, were a lot of the restrictions that mostly still there with use cases. So we were very interested in having our characters talk to people as the characters, and so you can imagine that could be one of their problematic areas, right? So it could definitely have a potential for being nefariously used or whatever, someone pretending to be a human. But we try to clarify, like, we're not pretending to be human, but we're trying to make this character as lifelike as possible, so that you treat it as such and you respect the character, kind of thing. It was back and forth with them over what procedures we had in place to make sure that it didn't go off the rails and in a territory that would be problematic. And so it did take some effort and some haggling to get approved and things like that. So that took time. And then with those restrictions, we were able to implement it into the types of things we were doing. But everybody's been great over there.
That sounds great. As we are talking about the capabilities of GPT-3 as a model, as a large language model, do do you think GPT-3 is something revolutionary for storytelling? And what are some of the interesting ways you have experimented with the model? If you can share some.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think since, I forget who was first, but like, BERT, all these language models that were coming online were in the last 3 years, I guess, have been really exciting. And so because they're trained with text and they're trained on a sequence of text, sequence of tokens, and what they're trained on, which is the internet, which is a lot of people, posting stories and conversations and things like that. The idea was, well, can it tell a story? So I would say maybe more the technical achievements that came out, right, where it was people were treating it like, it's a true on, it's the last AI type of thing, right? They were giving it quizzes and things like that. And yeah, I can pull that stuff off, but I think what people don't realize, it's just telling a story. It's trying to give a good answer to the story you're proposing. But if you tell a fantastical story in your prompt, it will come up with fantastical answers as well, right? So it's not a truth teller, I would say. It's a storyteller by its nature, right? It's just trying to find patterns in language. Like when I see these types of patterns, these are the types of patterns that follow. And we think about stories that we have, which is something we're proud of as a company, is our storytelling ability. We get like what goes into those stories and how the structure of those stories is. So I think in some ways we're maybe uniquely able to capitalize on some of the storytelling ability. And so to give you a concrete example, I wrote a short story essentially GPT-3, right? Now I was the editor of that story, and I went in and made editorial decisions about like, a bunch of text would come back and I would decide, well, that sounds good, or let me try like 4 or 5 options and pick the best one, or that's almost what I want. I'm just going to tweak this one word or this word. But I was able to write like a whole, I would say a mediocre short story, but a whole short story that, was coherent and made sense, So the trick there was it didn't write the entire story itself. For one, there's all these limitations around the size of the prompt, and the response you get back is either, I think it's still 1024 tokens or 2048 tokens. And so that's a challenge. So if you write a longer story, you can't have the entire beginning of the story with you. You have to kind of chunk it up into pieces and decide what to summarize about the earlier part of the story. And, sometimes you have to like, I kind of want you to go this way. So I'm going to give you like a couple words in the first sentence to get you to kind of go that direction now because you're getting stuck over here. But I think that's what's exciting. I think that some of the expectations early on was that GPT just does everything for you. And really it's a collaborative tool, right? I mean, things like we have Photoshop, right? We have, tools that we use that we don't actually go in pixel by pixel and change things. We have tools that sort of automate a lot of it for us. So, there's amazing, like a background eraser tool. You just sort of erase people out of images and things like that now. So it's that type of tool where it's a collaborative tool that, in the hands of a person who knows storytelling and things like that, it can get even better results. So I think that's what we're very excited about. And, the challenge is how do you take it from sort of a manual back and forth experimental process like that? How do you create these, experiments, and then how do you get them to something that's able to be put into production or at least be used by everyone in a more systematic way?
Like my question can be a little bit of a segue, but I was curious about your take on this because recently we had this news that everybody got interested in, that Facebook rebranded as Meta, and then made this big statement that they are going to double down and like fully focus on the concept they call Metaverse. As you are creating virtual characters, avatars, and you're participating in sort of building this vision that Facebook has, do you feel like tools like GPT-3 will help to get us there faster? And generally, what do you think about that idea?
Try to give you my take, and I'll pass it to Ed. Yeah, I mean, I would say that we're not Facebook's vision of our vision of the metaverse are not the same thing. We've been thinking and working on these things since well before their announcement. So I'm glad to see them focusing in on the metaverse. I think beyond just sort of the branding idea, it's probably a positive shift for them. But their vision of the metaverse is sort of very Facebook centric. It almost feels like the AOL of the metaverse is the Facebook of the metaverse, right? It's like a walled garden. You go in there and everything's through them. So I think we're excited to see more of a decentralized, which kind of ended up with the internet and things like that. It's not sort of this walled garden approach. As far as what was the second half of your question, sort of the take on it, and then
so how do you see GPT-3 capabilities sort of enabling this vision?
I mean, we say GPT-3, but I think what we want to imagine is like GPT-7, right? And because the current model is not there where it can just do everything for you. But like I said, it is a tool. So we're working on these things now. So I'm just going to say that we do see a place for GPT-3 in that world. I think taking advantage of, just like I was talking to you before, of the capability of it to be generating these ideas and have human beings in the loop to sort of curate them is sort of the best of both worlds, right? Speed us up in a lot of content creation, but it's also not it's not ready for prime time by itself. You want to add to that, Ed?
Yeah, I think a few things. One is that actually since working with GPT-3 for a while, I've personally lost faith in the approach that it's taking. I don't think that just figuring out what the right next word is going to work. I also don't personally believe in the idea that if we just add more processing power and we get larger and larger models and scrape more and more data, that's going to get us to AGI, which is the implication of what is sometimes talked about. And I do think that 3D spaces give us the opportunity to give AI spatial understanding, to de-emphasize language as the only mode for us to interact with AI, and to have AIs that can walk around the metaverse, explore the metaverse. And I also personally think that the metaverse might give us the opportunity to unlock humans, as Frank's saying, humans being in the loop and humans helping train virtual beings. So more of a hybrid approach where maybe a human has a kind of sense of ownership over the AI character and can help that character grow and get smarter. Because I think we're reaching the limits of GPT-3. And my understanding is that GPT-4 is actually also exploring multimodal approaches and spatial understanding, and similarly not de-emphasizing, but adding to language. A language-only approach, I think, is wrong. And I also think an approach that's just gathering more and more data surreptitiously is not sustainable either ethically or technologically if we want to get to AGI, and that having humans feel a sense of ownership and want to train these characters will start to be clearly necessary if we don't want to cap out in our progress. And I think anyone spending a significant amount of time talking to a GPT-3 powered character would see that ceiling fairly quickly. It's very good for things that maybe redirect away from itself. So a therapist, right, redirects attention away from itself onto the interlocutor. It's also very good for things that do have a very large base of knowledge about them, like a celebrity or like a character that's archetypal, like Jesus or like Santa Claus or Dracula, where there is a legitimately large amount of information about that person. But obviously that caps out around whatever information has already been written. And so I think we need radical new thinking And I think the metaverse offers significant opportunities to put these AIs in 3D spaces and allow them to live simulated lives with human intervention, with humans kind of helping the characters grow.
Those
That's
are
very, very interesting. Yeah, Shubham, go ahead.
yeah, I was just saying the same. Those are some really interesting points to think about. And so far, we have been talking about how GPT-3 has eased the process for you guys. But if you have to mention, like, what were some of the biggest challenges that you came across while integrating GPT-3 with your product or bringing it into your process? If you can talk about that.
Yeah, I think I might highlight that well, I mean, there's the cost, right? So, like, how long has it been? Do you remember what was the beta release? Was it end of last year?
Yeah, it seems like about a year ago.
Yeah, so it's only been a year, which is kind of crazy, right? But I think, there's two things that sort of make it a bit of a challenge. One is the interface and one is the price. And so for the first while, there was no pricing information released. So you had some of these startups like, let's say AI Dungeon and some of these other ones come online and, they're just cranking through requests, right? But the challenge is that was before the pricing was released. So and then once the pricing was released, you see how expensive it is to run it. That's a whole different thing. So some of that can be mitigated with, one of the challenges, like the more you want to make it very specific. So you want to give it as much prompt, which is essentially the request, right? You want to give it as much information from each request because it doesn't have any memory, right? So you have to, like, every request, you can give it sort of all the memory, all the details, and generate something that adds to it. And so with the cost of having to, like, send as much as you can possibly kind of fit into there to feed it as best you can, and being charged for essentially every time you feed it just to generate a few lines, you're charged for the entire set of tokens. That could be a challenge. So I think that the cost model is a bit of a challenge. I'm excited to see somebody try to sort that out. I think they try to figure it out. But then the other side is just from a technical standpoint, most models are very, let's say, technical. Like the API, the interface to it is very technical. You would, get an image and you would take that image and, like, break down its pixels into, like, one line of pixel data, right? And feed it in or something like that. And it's dealing with, like, just raw numbers. But the input for this is tokens, which from the human's perspective are words. And so your API for this thing is text. And it's just a very strange, I don't think, like, nothing's quite been done like that before. Where maybe search is maybe the closest thing that I can think of where the interface is really like textual input. You're kind of telling it what you want, and then you're getting a result back or a bunch of results you get to choose from. And so just programmatically, you're sort of constructing a text document on the fly to say, like, this is the these are, like, the tokens within my document that I want to swap in and out. It's like a template, and then I send that off to GPT-3 and get it back. So the construction of that template took some thinking. It's not something that's, like, it's not typically done, let's say. So it definitely took some imagining about what would that interface look like, what would a template for a prompt look like. So yeah, that's been a bit of an adventure.
So as we are talking about the pricing point, right, and pricing being a crucial part of any business. So can you comment on how does the pricing of GPT-3 API work for your business? Because I can understand, like, calculating unit economics and pricing per API call might be a bit tricky for conversational use cases, and especially when it is calculated in terms of tokens, then it's hard to estimate how much is exactly charged per API call. So did you figure out a way around it, and, like, how do you guys work with this kind of pricing model for your particular business?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely consideration. It's not astronomical, but you say unit scale. So if you're doing a lot of requests for a lot of people, then with a lot of tokens, right? So that's, like, you kind of multiply all those up, you end up with a large cost. So we've actually never really run too hard into the cost issue because a lot of things we're doing kind of pre-generation. So, experiments and pre-generation means that, we pre-generate a bunch of options and then we can use search to find the right option to respond back with. We don't run into those cost issues as quickly. Or even just how many users you have. So a lot of times we've kind of pivoted to a model that you could talk about where Lucy is actually kind of one-to-one, but in a Twitch stream now. So she's having this one-on-one conversation, but it's being consumed by thousands of people that are watching her instead. So that alleviates the sort of bandwidth issue of, how many people Lucy's interacting with at any given time. If it's just one person, and then that if there's an audience for that, and that goes out to many more people, that's a way to kind of leverage that. You want to add to that, Ed?
I think that's makes sense.
So I wanted to follow up on what you mentioned, Edward, about losing faith in tools like GPT-3 to create a compelling narrative, and that users of GPT-3 powered, especially characters. When you're interacting with them, you can sense that there's a limit to this character, basically. So as you are focusing on building these multi-dimensional, coherent characters that others can enjoy interacting with, such as Lucy, I'm curious if, other than you feel these limits and they probably annoy you a lot, do you feel like you've found some good ways to become the GPT-3 whisperers, to get the most out of it in that sense? And how to do that? I'm just thinking from the perspective of somebody that's thinking about just using GPT-3 or the following models that will come as a backbone for their storytelling.
The suggestion that I think we're making is one that we've been making for a while around multimodal learning, around what we call artificial coherent intelligence. So instead of just a far off future of AGI, trying to learn how to get multimodal learning and having different modalities around vision working together. But the big but would be that maybe a year ago, I would have felt that it would be very exciting, chatbots over Zoom would be really exciting and interesting and, all that. But I do think it's maybe both emotionally not the right thing, because you're a human and the character is a CG character on a 2D plane, but also technically getting computer vision and effective computing maybe isn't that helpful. I haven't seen that there are many positive examples of effective computing. There was an attempt to make it work with autonomous vehicles and all of that. So they could tell if you were falling asleep. That's a pretty limited use range. So I'd say the big change for me in the last year has been something Frank's been talking about a lot, which is virtual worlds. So our suggestion for people exploring this would actually be to abandon the chatbot model. That it's sealing out significantly, and it's very focused on language only and the single modality, and to focus on characters being in virtual worlds, having routines and lives. This is something Replica is exploring as well, with the virtual beings having their own apartments, and they're going to be exploring, you might want to watch the Virtual Being Summit interview with her, they're going to be exploring a metaverse for their replicas, so that those replicas can meet each other and interact with each other, and eventually you can be there as well. And I don't think that's just marketing talk, because the metaverse is hot. This is something they've been working on for about 18 months, or even longer with their AR and VR experiments. So I think putting the characters into virtual worlds plays to the strengths of virtual beings. And I wouldn't even think of it as just a GPT-3 whisperer. The point is to make a character that feels alive, and GPT-3 is one of many tools. And if it's true that GPT-4 is exploring spatial understanding of virtual spaces, then they're thinking the same thing, that there's just a ceiling to large language models and chatbots, and that's not the right path. And potentially giving virtual beings genuine understanding of the spaces that they're navigating could unlock, genuine learning for these characters, as opposed to no underlying understanding of what they're saying, just kind of guessing the right next word or the right next phrase or the right next sentence based on their kind of study of the whole internet. So we would I think recommend get out of the business of one-on-one texting and video chatting and start exploring 3D worlds. That those are uniquely suited to AIs and virtual beings, and they're going to come much faster. A virtual character exploring and interacting with the virtual world is going to come way faster than a robot going to, like what Elon Musk was talking about, a robot going to get you to groceries or something like that. All of that is so hard and millimeter precise for computer vision that virtual worlds would be better.
There's a lot to do with setting expectations too. We, in our case, we had this very delightful character that won an Emmy. So like, it's one thing to just come up with Dracula and be able to talk to Dracula, and there's some expectations there of who Dracula is. But there's been so many flavors of Dracula that I think people are willing to say, well, is that the character? Is that not the character? That's close enough. We had a very, very specific character that we created, right? That was from the mind of Neil Gaiman, and we expanded on it in our work. And so, part of the challenge is GPT doesn't know our character, right? It's not in its repertoire. And so getting it to generate things that related to that character, that's, I think, where the whispering comes in, is just, what are the things that are important for it to know? What are the things that aren't important for it to know? Because every prompt that you generate, you have to include some of that. And so it's just it's a prioritization thing, because you have this budget, both of cost and of pure limitation. Like you cannot generate, you can't, sort of get this envelope of size. And if you fill it up with prompt, you can generate less output, right? And so that it's all this kind of balancing act of what can I tell it that's actually helpful, because if I tell it something that's not helpful, then we sort of wasted, micro pennies, right? But if you add that up to a lot, so it becomes a thing. And so if you like these open I want to say open source characters, but these like characters that their IP is like over 100 years old, that's definitely like an easier place to start, because the model has probably remembered so much about those types of people than it is to do a very specific character. But at the end of the day, there's your character is sort of that's the unique thing, interesting thing you're doing. Then you need to figure that out, and so that's what we've really tried to focus on.
Those are some really insightful and wisdom-filled advices that people listening to this will get. So you guys being an early adopter of the API, I am curious to know how actively you collaborate with OpenAI, and does OpenAI provide you any kind of specialized support to help you with the prompt engineering or to help you understand the API response that can better suit your needs? How does that process looks like?
Yeah, I would say I think they do offer a sort of service now where they give you a little bit more support, like a support contract. I haven't looked at it recently. We were so early though; it was before any of that stuff existed. So to a certain extent, we figured it out ourselves. And so once you figure it out yourselves, I think maybe there's less value for that. They do offer services like fine tuning the model. I know that other companies have done that. And but I'm not sure how successful it was, but it logically makes sense, right? Like if, for instance, I complained that, not complained, but I acknowledged that they don't know our character, right? It's not like such a popular character that it has like a knowledge base of that character just by reading the internet, right? And that character could be, a character from a recent movie or a celebrity or whatever. But so you need to find a way to give it that information. So it does make sense to be able to take a lot of that information about the character and sort of add it to the corpus of GPT-3, to the detriment of, you don't need, if a character is like Lucy, she doesn't know the finance trading algorithm that was the most popular thing in 1924 or something like that they get ripped off of Wikipedia, right? She doesn't need that extra information. So, what you do need is sort of the basic human, I understand these, basic way the world works. And I know how different types of characters talk. But at the same time, the model actually has more information than any one of us. And so it's some ways could be too smart, at least as far as too knowledgeable, let's say. So this fine tuning training idea is interesting, because you could train like a smaller model that should be cheaper to run, but focusing it on the thing that you're actually generating and the prompts that you're giving. But first you have to collect that data. So you have to go and generate data for it to train on. And so that's a whole process in and of itself. And it's not something we really invested in because we felt like we got a kind of good enough result out of it for what our use case was. But logically, it makes sense that the fine tuning on any AI model, fine tuning on something is probably an advantage, but you have to have that data.
So I have a question about like.
I want to just. I need to prep for my 11 o'clock, so I'm going to jump off a little bit early. But yeah, this was super fascinating, and I'm available for any email follow up and questions and all of that.
Awesome, thank you, Edward. We will definitely catch up with you. Thanks.
Okay,
cool.
Thanks for showing up.
All right. Thank you so much.
Speak to you in a bit.
Bye.
Alrighty, I actually now have a more of a business, I guess, question. But Frank, I think you're also very well equipped to tackle it. So I'm curious, you are the studio that is looking at these innovative toolboxes that you can implement into your narratives. You're very open to that. You're like interested in exploring this. Would you say, do you feel after spending some time with AI that it gives you some sort of edge over studios that are building characters without AI, without these latest technologies out there?
It's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, I think it does give an edge. It's all dependent on the use case, right? But, let's say creative writing is a good example and something I think GPT is actually pretty good at. You could rely on a writer, let's say an expensive studio writer, Hollywood writer or something that's me, Writers Guild and things like that, to go create a script for you or to take a script from you and improve it. And, they have a lot of skill and experience and they could probably do that extremely well. But it won't be free, right? There is a cost to that. So if you're a company that has, maybe aspiring writers, they're not like Hollywood, writers that you want to augment, right? So that's sort of where like you kind of take someone who's like mediocre. Let's take myself, a mediocre writer, right? And with GPT-3 is like a kind of superpower, right? If you're an idea generation tool, that alone I think is really useful, right? Where you can sort of just keep clicking, try again. What other ideas you got? It's sort of a writing partner. I think that is a very useful tool in and of itself. And so, if you're a studio and you have all these resources, a large studio, and you have all these resources for writing and things like that, and you have a huge budget for a AAA game or something like that, then sure, like you don't really need it maybe. But you do see where games that have so much content, they are leaning into this direction. Like we work with Lip Sync Fender, who works with a lot of the large games, and so they just don't have the time and resources even for them to lip sync. Like take Cyberpunk or something like that. Right? There's just so many characters, so many dialogue lines. It's just unreasonable to have them actually be lip synced. So they use this tool to get. It's okay. Like it's not the main content, right? It's not. It's sort of side quests and things like that, but it's enough quality that they can get the content out there and it's good enough, right? And so I think a lot of GPT-3 stuff is good enough, right? It takes an editor, I think, more than a writer to kind of guide it and make sure that it's getting somewhere useful, but it can be a really valuable tool and a leg up for studios or even individuals who would like to make a lot of content, but just don't have either the skill or the time to generate a lot of content. It's much easier, I think, to just kind of go in and curate a bunch of content than it is to sort of start with a blank page and figure out what you're going to write. So I think that's definitely a leg up. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Like, honestly, I would not be surprised if Bethesda on the next Skyrim has generated for all like a bunch of NPCs in the background, like just use a bunch of OpenAI like stuff. It's all kind of owned by Microsoft now. So it would not surprise me whatsoever that some recent game that comes out is going to be using this tech because and it won't be for the main storyline, right? There's going to be professionals, let's say, to do that. But when you're thinking about all this like little side quest content, like that's going to happen. It's going to happen soon, I think. So we'll see.
That's great to know, Frank. And following up on this, like somewhere I don't exactly remember, but somewhere I've heard that we are not too far away from creating an entire Hollywood movie on the laptop. and you guys are taking us in that direction, and you guys are in the space. What are your views on that? Like, is it really possible to create a full-fledged Hollywood movie on a laptop, maybe a few years down the line? What do you think about that?
I think it already is to a certain extent, right? But it's like not just one person's laptop; it's like many laptops, right? You know, you look at a full CG movie or computer animation; it can be all done essentially people contributing. If you look at the most recent Blender does these animated movie shorts every couple of years, and it helps propel the technology that they're building, and it also kind of shows off the latest tools under it. So I think already people could create, you know, a Hollywood-esque thing, but it takes a lot of effort. I guess still, you know, it's a small team of maybe 10, 15 or something that do this. And so, you know, I think there's been a lot of focus of AI as the character. Like it's, and we think of an AI, like we think of a sci-fi character, right? We think of, you know, Terminator, or we think of things that are, you know, Westworld or something like that. We think of one AI being one character, and that's, I think, just a product of like you have a brain, and I have a brain, and so we sort of equate AI to the brain. But in some ways, we want to get to a point where the storyteller, like we want to have a Stephen King or a Michael Crichton AI, right, who can model the characters in their brain of like, you know, this character has this journey and this character does that. So I think that's an exciting space that we're particularly interested in moving forward. And I think it is something that is feasible for people to do. I mean, if you go back to, I don't know if you know the Rooster Teeth people, like the red versus blue cinema, what do they call them, machinima. You know, essentially taking computer games and animating in the computer game and voicing it and coming up with content. It was pretty popular on YouTube, like, I don't know, was it 10, 15 years ago? And so, yeah, I think the if you look at what is the trend, right? That the trend is, you know, more people with like less depth of experience can do more things because of automation. And AI and GPT is just part of that automation, I think. People are getting more capable, and people are creating more and more stories and more creative, you know, things that they can do. So it's an exciting space.
That sounds great.
Absolutely. So as we come to wrap up the interview, we always ask this sort of reflective philosophical question. If you look back at your experience with GPT-3 in your company, is there things that you wish you would do differently today?
Honestly, I don't know. You know, we, being a smaller studio, we had a lot of flexibility, and leading the research side had a lot of flexibility to bring this online. At other companies I've been a part of, maybe it would have been sort of a fight. You know, we want to do this experiment. We want to invest this time and energy into exploring this cool new tool. Well, it's like, well, where does that fit into our roadmap or whatever? You know, what's so cool about Fable, and, you know, by the way, we're hiring, is that, you know, it's a very exciting, we're on the very, very cutting edge. So being able to experiment with these things is like demanded of you, right? That's like, you know, what's the next cool thing? We have to be trying it because, you know, we have to make sure that it's going to work for us, and that'll be our advantage. So, you know, I think we used it heavily. We experimented with it heavily. We were able to do like some big events with it where we relied heavily on it. And, you know, even just the creation of content where we got to see like the full extent of it. So I think even if GPT isn't the thing that gets us there, it is that type of thing. I think, you know, these large language models or these interfaces with prompts or, you know, it's going to be one piece of a larger puzzle, but it was a kind of a brand new paradigm of even how you would approach this type of problem of, you know, the sort of textual interface. A good example is what they've taken GPT-3 and trained it on code, right? So OpenAI has a code version of this where you sort of say, hey, I want a function that, you know, will generate 20 people and give them random names. You just enter and it writes the code for you. You know, someone who's been coding for 20 years now, I appreciate how impressive that feat is. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of focus on GPT being this like character language generator, you know, it's a chatbot generator, but I think we're still scratching the surface of these types of models and what they can do. So definitely excited to see where these things go.
So, Frank, just last thing before we wrap up. As you mentioned, you have experimented heavily with the API and have a vast experience of using it. So, in your experience, have you ever encountered any downtime or any unexpected response with the API?
Yeah, early on, these were early in the beta days, we did have some hiccups where making requests, either you have to kind of watch out for the spending limit. So you set a spending limit. So we purposely set like a low spending limit to make sure we didn't, one of the things is you're giving this tool out to people. And so just internally, right? So it's one thing to even give the tool out externally, but just internally, cost control is definitely something that you should be thinking about early on. One thing we didn't invest in because it wasn't worthwhile was sort of having a mediary where, the requests go to sort of our server and then the server relays that out. And so we can track like who on the team is spending how much on what tokens, or, limiting the users who are participating with us to a certain amount of tokens or something like that. That's something that you have to consider. It's not something that's built into their system. So, cost control is definitely something to worry about. But yeah, I think, what was your question again? Sorry.
Yeah, so I really I asked, like, have you experienced any kind of unexpected response or unwanted response from the API?
Yeah, here and there. They did have some API changes that were breaking. Again, this was like early on, but they used to have a Slack channel, which they've discontinued. Now they have like a full, like a forum type thing. But it was nice that when they had the Slack, you could immediately like kind of reach out to the product team and say, hey, what's up, or ping some of the support people. So, we haven't really had problems with the support side of it. I think, the biggest unknown was what was the pricing going to be, and it came out in a place that was pretty expensive. So I think it changed the calculus for a lot of people who were experimenting with it early. Of like, we'll just put it out there and like let everybody use it, and then you add up the cost. It's like, okay, we have to find somebody to make money off this thing, right? Or at least balance it out. And so the cost was sort of a surprise, or let's say a little bit of a disappointment, because it limited what we were able to really do with it. I'd say and the few times we've had issues, or I guess the approval process was another sort of unknown, right? Where you want to sort of plan, like, we're going to put all this effort and engineering and research into using this tool. Will we be able to use it for our use case? And so their sort of terms of use and things like that, and their approval process was a little bit opaque. I think it's improved since they're sort of trying to make sure that people aren't using it for nefarious reasons and things like that. And so while I appreciate the effort, everything's so new and we were so early that there was stuff to figure out there. So we had to be a little conservative about what techniques we did, and making sure like humans in the loop and things like that, just so that we didn't have problems with it. Like some of the other companies did.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for showing up, and let's keep in touch. Take care.
Cheers.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Great talking to you. Bye.